the mid 19th century, as the country was on the kind of eve of the Civil War, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a text called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which accomplished a complexity of things, kind of instilled certain ultimately unhelpful stereotypes about African Americans, et cetera. But at the time, it ironically sensitized individuals in the North to the plight of Blacks in slavery in the South. By undergirding people's conception of the institution with the kind of harsh, personal exercise that it was for the enslaved. At the same time, in response to that text, there was literature that followed that was we call now anti-Tom literature, which was seeking to, in many ways, try to argue against what was the kind of reaction to Stowe's work, trying to argue that the institution of slavery was benevolent, it accomplished positive things for the enslaved, et cetera. And so you had this kind of debate going on in the 19th century with these kind of literary texts. That's a particular historical inquiry into that conversation about whether the institution of chattel slavery was or could potentially be benevolent for the enslaved, right? That's very different than someone arguing today that same premise, right? One is a historical inquiry looking at a particular context in which this is actually a live debate. Another is someone making the kind of contemporary claim, looking back on the institution with all that has happened, all the history that we've been bequeathed, and yet concluding or arguing that the institution of chattel slavery perhaps was benevolent for the enslaved, a good thing for the country, et cetera. That latter point obviously would be one that all of my students would take issue with, and rightly so. The question becomes, to your point, what does one do when in that setting and faced with that kind of argument, right? And I think that even in that scenario, as Diana said, depending on how the argument is laid out, that's very important. I've heard people say some things that I took great offense to, but they didn't say it offensively, if that makes any sense. I had a big issue with the argument, and I was going to go to work and undergirding why I had issue with the argument. But the way in which it was delivered, I think, made a difference in how I engaged with that argument. There is a way in which you can address a particular argument that you take a particular exception to in ways that I think are appropriately perhaps decisive and in many ways meeting that argument with the full emotion and conviction that you have in terms of addressing it in ways that is good for the discourse, right? In ways that I don't think even undermines the general commitment to intellectual charity. I think it falls within that paradigm, depending on what you're talking about, how you're engaging. But certainly there are, I raise that example as one that in a historical context provides a robust conversation. In a contemporary setting, one making the argument, students would find objection to it. There are certain other things that I've actually seen people still calling into question or treating as legitimate, calling into question the veracity of particular historical events, be it the Holocaust or whatever, right? Those things are appropriately met with a degree of decisive judgment against those claims because of the history that we've been bequeathed, because of all that has come before us, because of what is at stake. We have to meet those arguments with those kinds of dispositions. And again, I don't think that again is contrary to the principle that we're seeking to commend today. It just demonstrates that this is a complex task of trying to embody this principle, given the various degrees of arguments and ideas that we confront.
And also given the various levels, educational levels. I mean,
sure.
If you're teaching in elementary school, that's one thing, and how one deals with kids in elementary school versus middle school versus high school versus college versus a law school. I mean, I teach at a law school, and frankly, with teaching in a law school classroom, I find it hard to imagine an issue that ought not be open, including, the most, slavery. Should people be able to sell themselves into slavery? As far as I teach contracts, I'm game. Let's talk about it. It seems to me at a certain level, virtually anything, should be talked about. I think that the people who have the more difficult problem, are people who are dealing with younger minds. So if you're dealing with people whose level of intellectual maturity is such that you can't give them as much leeway as I can give, I find it perfectly easy. There is nothing that, in my view, is outside of discussion in a law school classroom. But that's law school. We're talking about people who've, been through, college educated. We're talking about people in their mid-20s. That's a very different thing than, a 15-year-old. And I think that people who are dealing with 15-year-olds have a much more difficult task in certain ways than the task that, I confront teaching in a law school.
Randy, I'm imagining many of our listeners may be cringing a little bit. And I'm wondering if you can help us distinguish. I imagine it's one thing if we sort of open this conversation about, say, whether slavery could be justified in a sort of hypothetical or historical, or if we kind of have if we're 1 degree removed, we're just sort of like, what would one say, sort of way, as opposed to a student in your classroom is saying, no, slavery was justified and here's why, as an expression of personal conviction. Would you treat those cases differently?
No. And if a student said that, okay, what are your reasons? What are your reasons? One of the problems with the settled issue point is that I've seen situations in which ideas have been deemed to be settled, and because they've been deemed to be settled, people have actually forgotten how to argue against a position that they rightly disdain. But they've lost the arguments. They actually don't know why they believe what they believe. So frankly, I don't mind it when I have someone who quite radically, challenges the conventional wisdom that's in the room. Because when they radically challenge the conventional wisdom, it actually makes people think, oh, well, why do I think what I'm thinking? I find that pedagogically very useful.
Can I just respond to that really quickly?
Yeah, please.
Sure. No, to that point, and and this is, people have different convictions about this. I literally had a conversation with a Harvard undergrad. There was a speaker that was invited to campus, and intentionally, I'm not going to say who the speaker was, because you literally could put a lot of people in this list. We've all seen this happen. And protest ensued because the ideas of this particular speaker were deemed inappropriate for college affirmation, inappropriate for platform. And in many ways, I understood those arguments, right? It was potentially giving voice to particular ideas and concepts that have had a long history of landing in particularly oppressive, et cetera, ways, right? I think that's clear. I think that's understandable. One of the things and as such, I thought that was one appropriate means of showing up and displaying your disapproval, right? So I have no problem with that. What I just wanted to offer to the student was, to Randall's point, that there's another appropriate avenue that is just as powerful, and that is allowing the person in the doors, unlock the doors, take chains off the doors, allow them to give their talk, and then do that age-old thing that we've seen in discourse and discussion. At the end of that talk, steam your way through the talk, let them raise your hand and argue against those particular ideas, right? And what I suggested was, I'm not against the protest modality at all. I'm not against it at all, but understand that don't downplay and discredit the equally powerful means of, operating. Listen to the talk, bite your tongue. During Q&A, go to work. and then perhaps have a particular effect on those ideas in the long run, to Randall's point, that has a sustaining impact, rather than this person just doesn't speak. You deliver a particular powerful message that way. You deliver an equally powerful message. This person spoke, those ideas got exposed. Perhaps
I agree with what you said, and I think that one thing you should also keep in mind in the setting. Now, again, we're talking about a somewhat different setting than a classroom setting, but
right.
The setting that you're talking about, I would say to folks, don't forget the audience. Don't forget that there are going to be some people who show up because they're curious. So I'm with you. I think people should voice. So for instance, the people who are engaged in protest, they're expressing themselves, fine. I also think, however, don't be afraid of ideas. Do not be. Frederick Douglass was perfectly prepared to argue with people who were supporters of the slave power. He was perfectly happy to argue with them. They did not want to tangle with him. They wanted to shut him up. They wanted to gag him. He, however, was willing to argue with the proponents of the slave power. And again, it seems to me it's important for people to listen to others, even those who have ideas that you really, you despise. But it takes practice to actually master the counter arguments. And if you don't, interact with people, that is a type of mastery that you can lose.